Okay, so hello everyone. From wherever you are within or outside Canada, my name is Prof. Collins Ifonu, and I am the president of the University of Alberta's Black Graduate Student Association. And on behalf of the BGSA and Dr. Shirley Ann Tate, who is the Canada Research Chair and Professor in Feminism and Intersectionality, I'm delighted to welcome you to the final installment of our speaker series for the term, entitled Refusal as Affective and Pedagogical Practice with Michalinos Zembylas. Now, as we have repeated throughout this series, our goal is to foreground crucial discussions on topics related to race, racism, anti-racism, and decolonization, both within and outside Canada. We do not treat these concepts as buzzwords, but we seek a critical understanding of them for the benefit of those whose scholarly, personal, or advocacy interests take them up as guiding principles. Now, I wish to acknowledge that the University of Alberta, which is hosting this speaker series and hosting us virtually today, is located on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous peoples, including the Papaches, Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Inuit, as well as many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to exist, evolve, and revive ways of being, known, sharing of knowledge and creation. Now, usually at this point, we invite an Indigenous elder to provide some opening remarks. Elder Russell Auger has so graciously done this for us for the past 3 sessions, but we've had a last minute change. Elder Auger, unfortunately, has another engagement to attend to today and will not be joining us today, but we do have his blessing to move forward. And I will do that. I will proceed to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Michalinos Zembylas is Professor of Educational Theory and Curriculum Studies at the Open University of Cyprus, an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University, South Africa, an adjunct professor at the University of South Australia. Now, he has written extensively on emotion and affect in relation to social justice pedagogies, intercultural and peace education, human rights education, and citizenship education. Now, his recent books include Affect and the Rise of Right-Wing Populism, Pedagogies for the Renewal of Democratic Education, and a co-edited volume titled Higher Education Hauntologies, Living with Ghosts for a Justice to Come. So, Dr. Zembylas, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Please take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I especially want to thank Shirley for the invitation too. I will talk about a topic that I've been thinking about and writing about for the last several years, and so I'm eager to hear your reactions, especially from Canada. I'm presenting from Cyprus. It's late in the evening here. It's 8 o'clock. So forgive my if I say something that doesn't make any sense. Ask me later. So I think you should be able to see the slideshow. Mm-hmm. So the title of my talk today is Refusal as Affective and Pedagogical Practice in Higher Education, Decolonization. And I want to make a modest proposal that has to do with refusal as an affective practice. A theme that has recently emerged in contemporary literature on decolonization in higher education is refusing the colonial university. As Sandy Grant writes, the university historically functioned as the institutional nexus for the capitalist and religious missions of the settler state, mirroring its histories of dispossession, enslavement, exclusion, forced assimilation, and integration. Therefore, refusing the university means taking a political stance and action within, against, and beyond the university as such. Refusal is a kind of disinvestment from certain rules and relations, such as those that enable colonialism. And also, refusal means an affirmative investment at the same time to possibilities that invoke decolonization. While some accounts on the politics of refusal acknowledge the affective modes of legitimating and reproducing colonial hegemony, scholarship on decolonization in higher education has not paid enough attention to theorizing the affective contours of refusing the colonial university. So the central question I address in this talk today is what sort of affective disinvestment is needed in higher education to refuse the colonial university. In particular, how can educators and students in higher education invent what some scholars call pedagogies of refusal that function affectively and politically to challenge colonial futurity? What do pedagogies of refusal look like? Now, let me say a few things about affects, just for the sake of defining the terms I will be using. Affects are generally understood as relational and embodied intensities, and I'm using the foundational definition by Sickworth and Craig from 2010. They are embodied intensities that circulate in affective economies, as Sarah Ahmed says, in which feelings are mobilized to create particular affective attachments. These attachments mark the ways in which things become significant and relations are lived. In this sense, refusal may be conceptualized as an affective practice, to use another term by Weatherall, which produces political effects and desires that challenge normative manifestations of power and control. So the main objective of my talk today is to discuss the affective contours of refusing the colonial university and articulate what this analysis implies for pedagogies of refusal in the project of higher education decolonization. The discussion proceeds as follows. I will begin by briefly situating the project of higher education within the history and politics of colonization. Then I will provide a theorization of refusal in cultural anthropology and indigenous studies, focusing in particular on how refusal may be conceptualized in the terms of affective economy and affective practice. Next, I will outline 3 affective modes of decolonial refusal that challenge the colonial university. And these are refusal as social and affiliative, refusal as distinct from resistance, and refusal as hopeful and willful. Finally, I will conclude with outlining how these affective modes translate into an ethos of pedagogies of refusal for decolonization in higher education. And I want to say at this point that what I'm talking about here has been recently published in the journal Teaching in Higher Education. So if you want to read the full paper, it has been published in 2021. So here I'm basically going to summarize the main ideas. So let me begin with situating the project of higher education and its colonial legacies. Any effort to make sense of the project of higher education today has to be situated in the long history of colonialism. The European university model, grounded in Eurocentric epistemologies and colonial principles, has been imposed across the colonies in other continents, the Americas, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Therefore, it is important to acknowledge how the establishment of universities in many Western societies and colonies has been inextricably linked to colonial processes and practices that continue to shape contemporary higher education. Unless the project of higher education recognizes, confronts, and undoes its colonial legacies, it is difficult to imagine how the terms of current academic and political debates about the future of higher education will change. My point of departure is recognizing how settler colonialism and the frontier logic have been central to the institutionalization of universities to facilitate the integration of land and capital accumulation. As Luke and Heinen have said, the institutionalization of higher education is a key side of settler colonialism, and the frontier logic has been facilitated through three intertwined processes. And I want to quote them because these three processes are fundamental to understanding what I'm talking about. First, university involvement in indigenous removal and ongoing dispossession through occupation of indigenous land. Second, the advancement of empire building research and teaching agendas to commercialize and modernize neo-plantation agriculture. And finally, the contribution to shaping a racialized labor system in the exclusion of potential students deemed alien, illegal, or non-citizen. Historically then, the university has functioned as the institutional nexus for the capitalist and imperialist expansion of the settler state and its efforts to instigate dispossession, enslavement, exclusion, and oppression. For example, North American universities reproduced slavery to the extent that they served as key sites in the production, legitimation, and dissemination of ideas that justified and proliferated scientific racism and racial capitalism. As while their rights, and I think it was to read the whole quote, American colleges were not innocent or passive beneficiaries of conquest and colonial slavery. The European invasion of the Americas and the modern slave trade pulled peoples throughout the Atlantic world into each other's lives, and colleges were among the colonial institutions that braided their histories and rendered their fates dependent and antagonistic. The academy never stood apart from American slavery. In fact, it stood beside church and state as the third pillar of a civilization built on bondage. Higher education then functioned as a key technology, not only of colonial expansion in various continents, but also in being complicit to social reproduction for capital accumulation and capital expropriation. In fact, in the name of market-based ideologies such as democracy and the public good, higher education has been historically complicit in the further establishment of racialized, hegemonic settler capitalism. The contemporary university then functions in a space full of paradoxes, tensions, and complexities. On the one hand, it faces the rise of academic capitalism and the corporatization of higher education. The hegemonic reign of these trends preclude other educational possibilities from happening, such as broadening access to those who have been excluded, democratizing the university space, or contributing to confronting inequality and injustice in the world. On the other hand, if within the colonial university there is also a decolonizing education, as La Paperson and others have argued, then it is important to engage in efforts that build new modes of academic practices and alliances which not only recognize, analyze, and confront the university's complicity in coloniality, but also reclaim the academy as a decolonizing space. This is where refusal as a political ethos and practice may have a crucial contribution. Before talking about refusal, I think it's important to make an important distinction with resistance. Despite considerable disagreements as to what exactly it denotes, resistance is generally understood as an oppositional act. Refusal, however, is distinguished from resistance, as it does not always entail an act of opposition, but rather it is a kind of abstention and disinvestment from rules of engagement. Whereas resistance consciously defies or opposes superiors, refusal rejects this hierarchical relationship. So this is a fundamental difference between the two. As Simpson explains in her landmark ethnography of Mohawk political life and the indigenous relations to the settler state, refusal operates very differently from resistance. Whereas resistance may reinscribe the weakness of the colonized in the power relations with the colonizer, the settler state, refusal interrupts the smooth operation of power relations, denying the authority of the settler state and remaking the rules of engagement. Refusal then does not stand in opposition to repressive power and authority as resistance does. Instead, refusal is a political stance and action that denies the very legitimacy of power over the subjugated, seeking alternative forms of legitimacy. Practically, to give some examples, refusal is manifested in various activities, such as refusing to vote, pay taxes, or travel on settler nation documents. In tracing these refusals, Simpson invites us to seriously consider and explore what happens when consent is withdrawn and the ontological fixity of the settler state is unsettled. Undoubtedly, refusal is a political stance and praxis, as the works of Indigenous and other decolonial scholars like McGrath, Simpson, and Coulthard showed. One of the aspects of coloniality that has gradually come to the forefront of discussions in recent years is the colonial legacies of affects and emotions. That is how affectivity plays a major part in relations of coloniality and oppression, just as in seeking alternative relations and liberatory practices. Not only there is no escape from the emotional history of the past and the present rooted in coloniality, but also the achievement of social justice and the dismantling of colonial relations have been linked in part with the need to invest new affects and affective relations. Therefore, theorizing refusal, not only as political, but also as affective practice, is valuable in turning our attention toward the production of those affective practices that could challenge colonial practices and enable decolonization. In general, affective practices are understood as forms of activity that understand and mobilize affect as a central part of practice. This is from Weatherell. Through the lens of affect theory, all political practices are also affective ones. Viewing refusal as a form of affective practice helps us pay attention to the ways in which forms and structures of refusal come to be conceivable, how they are articulated and legitimated, and how they contribute to the reproduction or interlocution of colonial practices. In general, then, theorizing refusal as an affective practice helps us understand the ways in which alternative practices, indigenous liberatory practices, as Coulthard would say, may be invoked to challenge colonial relations. Intellectual analysis and critical consciousness are not enough to identify how harmful colonial practices are in the field of education and beyond. These practices need to be accompanied by actions that create affirmative disinvestment from those desires that perpetuate coloniality, such as autonomy, certainty, and accumulation of capital. In the context of higher education in particular, as I show next, refusal also requires the cultivation of new affective economies and practices that not only identify complicity in reproducing harmful promises and colonial effects, but also establish new solidarities, commitments, and possibilities for decolonization. So in this part of my talk, I focus on three affective modes of decolonial refusal that emerge for McGranahan's theorization of refusal in cultural anthropology. McGranahan, who draws on Simpson's work, details three aspects of refusal. Refusal as social and affiliative, refusal as distinct from resistance, and refusal as hopeful and willful. I argue that these three aspects may also constitute affective modes of decolonial refusal in higher education, and I explain below how this is so and why this is important for our efforts to engage in refusal practices in contemporary higher education. So let's take the first aspect. The first aspect is that refusal is social and affiliative. What does this mean? This aspect tells us that by refusing the colonial state's structures of social and cultural organization, practices of refusal enable the production of new forms of community and relationality. In relation to the colonial university, Sandy Grant suggests that the prospect of refusal raises a fundamental question in debates of higher education decolonization. And I quote, "What kinds of solidarities can be developed among peoples with a shared commitment to working beyond the imperatives of capital and the settler state?" End of quote. Making more explicit the link between affective refusal and solidarity, this question may be rephrased as follows. What kind of affective solidarities can be developed at the university so that peoples who work on various social justice projects, for example, anti-racist, anti-capitalist process, and so on, stand with, to use a term by Tolbert, stand with those struggling for decolonization? I don't have the time to address this question here, but what I would like to emphasize is the potential to create pedagogical and political spaces at the university that could inspire what I call anti-complicity praxis for all. That is, actions that actively refuse to commit any social harm in everyday life. The second aspect of refusal is its distinction from resistance. I talked about it earlier, so I won't say much here. I want to remind you that whereas resistance reaffirms the rules of engagement set by the state, refusal not only critiques them, but it also produces new rules and forms of relationality. It is a refusal to let go, to roll over, to play this game, as Simpson writes. These insights highlight not only the intellectual, but also the deep affective commitment that is required for decolonial refusal. If we, and by we, I mean educators and students, indigenous and non-indigenous alike, are effectively invested in the status quo, the empty promises or the complicity of those of us who benefit from this system, then unless we become effectively disinvested in this system, we run the risk of reproducing the colonized economies of affect that fortify so much of conservative, liberal, and even radical praxis. Hence, resistance may indeed not be enough in some circumstances. Refusal has to take the front seat and drive decolonization efforts in higher education. And finally, the third aspect is that refusal is hopeful and willful. What I mean by that is that decolonial refusal is combined with hope to highlight the visions, mournings, memories, voices, and spaces that have been relegated to silence as a result of coloniality. To challenge colonial relations in higher education without paying attention to the affective entanglements of refusal and hope, including their potential impact on social relations and processes, may ultimately prove unproductive, as it will miss accounting for the complex ways in which these effects and others may be embodied differentially in different peoples and sites. The hope that I'm talking about is not an empty or sentimental hope, but rather a material hope, deeply informed by the affectivity and materiality of the land as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations. This radical assertion of the land in discourses and practices of refusing the university is necessary to confront colonial relations. However, this means that the changes that need to happen at the university to become a place that reformulates the rules of engagement with the land and indigenous peoples should not be limited to hollow performances of recognition, such as routine-like territorial acknowledgements, which are quickly forgotten. These changes need to be forged as a fundamental disruption of the colonial affective logics that are manifested in all aspects of higher education. As I have argued so far, affect is key to refuse colonial relations at the university and beyond. If it is true that our deepest desires and emotions are tapped into for imperial production, then it is crucial to ask, and I'm quoting Agatha Angelou here and her colleagues, how we might organize, mobilize, and form alternative intimacies and desires that embody an ethos of refusal in higher education pedagogies. But how do the affective modes of decolonial refusal mentioned earlier translate, quote unquote, into an ethos of refusal in higher education pedagogies? First of all, I understand pedagogies of refusal to be those pedagogies that empower students, many of whom experience forms of colonial violence on a daily basis, and others who are complicit to this violence, to not only recognize these forms of colonial violence, but also disrupt, refuse, and displace them with alternative relations that affirm decolonizing imaginaries. Teaching the practice of decolonial refusal then entails the cultivation of embodied and affective refusal that challenges all forms of coercive violence. Therefore, it is crucial, according to Sandy Grant, to find common ground, as she calls it, among parallel social justice projects that aim to undermine colonial relations and practices. The common ground here, suggests Grant, is not necessarily literal, but rather conceptual, a corpus of shared ethics and analytics, anti-capitalist, feminist, anti-colonial. Rather than allies, we are accomplices, plotting the death, but not the murder of the settler university, as she writes. End of quote. Given the necessity and value of forming solidarities, it would be unwise, in my view, to create a quote-unquote competition among different social justice projects, or distinguish between those which are explicitly decolonial and others which are quote-unquote less so. Furthermore, attending to affect in pedagogies of refusal brings into view the micro-political dimension through which knowledge production takes place at the university. Knowledge production and legitimation at the university is one such activity. Teaching that compels students to critique colonial relations and their consequences is another. Both of these activities are intertwined and affectively grounded. For example, a point of departure for pedagogies of refusal is for educators to understand how affective dynamics function micropolitically to organize, mobilize, and form Indigenous and non-Indigenous students' responses toward the issue of land dispossession, and under which circumstances there can be an antidote to the affective ideology of colonial relations and practices in everyday university life. A key pedagogical question then is the following: how and with which resources can educators and their students first identify the forms of damage and harm that are reproduced by colonial relations micropolitically, and then explore different manifestations of decolonial action that would bring the desired transformations within or beyond the university. Now, to conclude, in this talk, I discussed how an affective pedagogy of refusal could create openings in higher education to offer first a disruption of empire's seductive promises, and then a hope and desire to form new solidarities and intimacies for decolonization. Refusal, I have pointed out, invokes a vision for both a decolonizing and affective approach that serves as public and political pedagogy, methodology, and intellectual analysis within and outside the university. Such a pedagogy, methodology, and intellectual analysis is derived from careful engagement with anti-colonial thought and its histories, theories, and practices of decolonization that are based on the entanglements of the political, the intellectual, and the affective. To this end, I suggest that it is crucial to focus on and enact pedagogies of refusal that engage with the affective disinvestments and investments of students and educators in colonial relations, if we are to disrupt the seductive workings of colonial power in its most intimate dimensions. Amid the apparent power of the neoliberal and neo-colonial universities, some may argue that pedagogies of refusal are utopian, as they invoke the idea of decolonial desires. However, as La Person reminds us, and I quote, "My position is impossible. A colonialist byproduct of empire with decolonizing desires. I am, and maybe you are too, a produced colonialist. I'm also a byproduct of colonization. As a colonialist scrap, I desire against the assemblage that made me." This impossibility motivates this analysis, which seeks not to resolve colonialist dilemmas, but to acknowledge that they include specific machined privileges that may be put to work in the service of decolonizations. La Person emphasizes that decolonial desires and visions are crucial in efforts to disrupt coloniality. It goes without saying that such desires by themselves will not dismantle colonial relations and structures, yet every position of impossibility also holds some kind of possibility. These impossibilities and possibilities coexist and are part of the potential of higher education decolonization. Crucially, decolonizing higher education is not the sole work of educators, students, or administrators in universities. Work outside the university is equally important. However, if there is one major argument emerging from this talk, is that it becomes crucial to continue exploring how universities are sites of both estrangements and intimacies. That is, affective sites of struggles against coloniality. As such, pedagogies of refusal within and beyond the university have an important contribution to seize the possibilities emerging from breaking down empire's seductive promises. Thank you.